Hello, it's January 18th, 2024, and welcome to this month's Rights in Russia interview. Our guest today is Professor Bill Bowring, who teaches human rights and international law at Birkbeck College, University of London. Bill first visited Russia in 1983 and returned many times until the COVID pandemic and then Putin's all-out war in Ukraine. Since 1992, as a practicing attorney, he has represented many applicants in cases before the European Court of Human Rights, especially on behalf of Chechen victims. He has been an advisor and expert consultant for the UN, the Council of Europe, the OSCE, and the UK government. In 2003, he received 1 million euros from the European Commission and founded the European Human Rights Advocacy Center, which partnered with the Russian NGO Memorial, which is now in exile. He has published widely, some in Russian, on international law, human rights, minority rights, and Russian law and philosophy. In recognition of his scholarship on Russia, he was conferred a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He was twice, in 2005 and 2007, arrested and deported from Russia in connection with his human rights activities, but got back in again. Welcome to Rights in Russia interview, Bill. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for the invitation.
We'd like to begin by looking at some history. For many years, you were a participant in and a close observer of Western support for human rights groups in Russia. To what extent should we say now that these efforts failed to consolidate civil society or to strengthen human rights protections?
Well, I think the important word there is consolidate, because what all of this money did, and I was expert in quite a lot of European Union TASIS projects and Council of Europe and OSCE work, amongst other things. And for sure, there was a large human rights bubble, particularly in Moscow, but in other cities as well. And it was possible for people to live in an environment in which they had friends and they were employed on projects which they were committed to. But I think somebody who's really put her finger on the problem is Mary McCauley, who was, when I first met her, the representative of the Ford Foundation in Moscow. And so she was a major grantor. And I have some experience of that because for several years I was working with Soros, giving grants to organizations in Russia. And what Mary writes correctly, and other people have said this too, is that there was really a disconnect, a very dangerous disconnect between the human rights world and the general population. And I think while it seemed big and important to people in the bubble, actually very few people outside of the bubble knew what on earth any of this was. And I do think that enormous amounts of money were wasted by the EU in particular, sending into Russia people who were meant to be experts, who were not experts. And what the Russians got was a big waste of their time quite often, but also, of course, trips to Europe. So I would say that it's important. But other things in terms of human rights much more important, like under Yeltsin, Russia joining the Council of Europe and ratifying the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Convention becoming part and parcel of Russian law. And actually, over the course of 20 years or so, a big impact on Russian law and practice. So then my line has always been that that was not a transplant into Russia, but it was a restoration of the great reforms of Alexander II of 1864. And I think that's how many people in Russia saw it.
Is there anything that could have been done differently to engage the general population more effectively?
Well, I think this idea, the very idea of engaging with the local population in this way, I think is a problem. And it was thought, I think, right back in 1991 that somehow Russia would quickly turn into a liberal democratic state. I mean, not that I think most liberal democratic states in the West have a huge amount to be proud of all the time. But there was this idea, which I think was a fantasy, as a matter of fact. I think it would have been much better to build on what Russia already had. And I think that's what the European Convention on Human Rights did.
So why has authoritarianism been so successful in Russia and civil society apparently so weak?
I think I already answered that in part, because civil society was, I mean, that is the very large number of people who were financed by Western projects of one sort or another. I think the disconnects between them and the rest of the population. So that was a real problem. I think authoritarianism, I mean, Germany, I think, went through a period of authoritarianism. I think Britain has a lot more to be proud of in its past. I think the United States of America is now split right down the middle. And there was a bloody civil war not very long ago. So I think one's got to be very careful in saying that Russians have an authoritarian regime because that is their nature, all they deserve is, which I'm afraid to say from some people sounds rather like what they're saying. I think that's a particularly horrible, nasty regime at the present moment. And I think a real lack of an opposition. But then, of course, Russia has always been the country of unexpectedness and big surprises. I mean, look at Prigozhin not very long ago. Nobody predicted that.
Right. Exactly. Yes, we're looking at that. That's a very good point. I kind of moving on now to the present. How is Russia's exclusion from the Council of Europe and the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights affecting both human rights and the work of lawyers and activists in Russia right now?
I think it's a disaster because, as I already said, in 1998, when Russia ratified the convention, it immediately became part of Russian law with superior status to all domestic Russian law. And I've written about this quite extensively. But major changes took place in Russian law and Russian practice as a result of judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. And practically every judgment of the Constitutional Court of the Russian Federation had references to cases in the European Court of Human Rights, and it was very much part of Russian law. And of course, one of the reasons why there were so many applications against Russia is that in Britain, most people are led to believe that the European Court of Human Rights is part of the EU, which we've left because of Brexit. And this is actually what we're told by newspapers like the Daily Mail and Daily Telegraph. So people in this country have no idea that the European Convention was founded by Winston Churchill and was a conservative project. I mean, you wouldn't think so from what's being said by all the people who want us to leave it. In Russia, actually, people had a very good idea what it was. And every lawyer would say to their client, okay, I'm sorry you lost, but now we're going to Strasbourg. And people knew what it was, and they knew that there was another court, even higher than the Constitutional Court of the Russian Federation, or the Supreme Court, to which they could take their complaints. And I took hundreds.
Is the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court, are they continuing to be effective places where people can bring complaints, human rights or otherwise?
I mean, what's happened since actually 2012 with the Foreign Agents Law is the annihilation of civil society in Russia. And that's not only the Western funded, but right across the board, environmental, children's rights, human rights. That's since 2012 when Putin came back to power. And then since the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, there's been an increasing clampdown. And now, of course, you go to prison for 15 years if you call what Russia is doing a war. It's a special military operation for denazification of Ukraine and demilitarization, says Putin. So, I mean, really, in recent years, all the gains that were made, which were considerable, and this affects everybody across the board. I mean, it means that NGOs no longer exist in Russia. Most of them are in exile. Many of the brilliant, wonderful lawyers have left and are in exile. I attended a few weeks ago a seminar in Moscow with wonderful people like Tamara Morshakova, who was the deputy chair of the Constitutional Court, and Kovler, who was the Russian judge on the European Court of Human Rights, and Andrei Medashevsky in Moscow. But people were having to speak in code, and almost certainly the last such possible event. Really, it's extremely dangerous in Russia at the present moment. That is not to say that there won't be even greater surprises than Prigozhin. And we've just seen riots in Bashkortostan in the last day or so, with large numbers of people. So, you know, Russia is the Strana neožídanosti, so it's the country of unexpectedness. And it's huge, it's too big, of course. And I think the real fear of many Russians is that when Putin goes, because he's mortal, actually, so he will go one way or another, the country is liable to fall apart. That would be extremely bloody. And there is no successor for Putin at the present time. I mean, he's made quite certain of that. So I think most Russians really, really fear the consequence of this idiotic war that he started on the 24th of February, 2 years ago now, for heaven's sake, expecting he would win in 5 days.
Right. So thinking about the human rights situation more generally in Russia, so what's it actually like? And can you make valid comparisons? Like, is it like the Soviet Union under Brezhnev or Hitler's Germany in the 1930s?
I think it will be Britain shortly if the present lot get their way, where lefty lawyers will be sent to prison, you know, asylum seekers will be sent to Rwanda, people will be prosecuted for freedom of speech. I think a country can tip very, very quickly from relative freedom of thought and freedom. I'm just writing a chapter for a new collection on freedom of thought. My chapter's on freedom of thought in Russia. And of course, Russia has a complicated history, but for heaven's sake, so does the United States, so does Britain. You know, so, but I think the real fear in Russia is that this huge country, 10 hours flying from one end to the other, where people in the Far East, their relations with China and Japan, they think, why are we sending all this money to Moscow? As a matter of fact, and people in the Urals think that. And of course, Russia is also a country with 4 official religions by law, with a huge Muslim population, with the ethnic republics, which where the regime has tried to crush the native languages and that kind of thing. But when you think Russia is a country with 150 ethnicities, and, you know, the 4 traditional official religions, but many more otherwise, I've actually traveled to more of Russia than most Russians, so I'm very lucky. And it is an extraordinary, varied country. And I think Putin poses a threat to the future existence of Russia. By the way, I compare him with Mr. Netanyahu. I think the two of them have an awful lot in common. Netanyahu poses a threat to the future existence of Israel.
Exactly. So you talk about the Far East. I just wanted to ask about the new, what seems to be the warmer relation between China and Russia. And is that influencing people in the Far East?
I think at one level, there was a move by China and Russia to say that they were representing real traditional international law, you see. And they had a common position, which was state sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs. However, since Putin started his war, I think relations with China are much more complicated because China does not want to get involved. It is absolutely not in their interests. And of course, one of the consequences of Putin's war is that Russia has lost a lot of influence in Central Asia and the Caucasus. I mean, I think what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh is a huge defeat for Russia. I mean, because their client, Armenia, was absolutely swept away just like that. So I think China sees opportunities, of course, and China's in there for sure. And then in Africa, we have this extraordinary situation where China is there with big soft power, in agriculture, education, infrastructure. Russia is there with Prigozhin, in the fight of the Central African republics to throw off France. So it's very different. I think China and Russia actually, it's like Russia and Turkey, where at the present moment, Turkey is kind of playing both ends. But I think that in the future, Turkey is looking eastwards. Azerbaijan is Turkish. Crimean Tatars are Turkish, by the way. 4 out of 5 Central Asian republics are Turkic. And there are 5 million Tatars in Russia. My wife is one. 3.5 million of them in Tatarstan. So I think it is all much more complicated, as a matter of fact, and in many ways dangerous than some pundits and analysts would like us to believe.
So there are numerous cases of human rights defenders being prosecuted. Oleg Orlov, the former chairman of the board of the Human Rights Center Memorial, is one example. Also human rights lawyers. The lawyer Ivan Pavlov has been forced out of Russia. Dmitry Talantov, president of the Bar Association in Udmurtia, is in pretrial detention on charges of defaming the Russian army. Lawyers who acted for Alexei Navalny are being prosecuted. Lawyers defending Crimean Tatars have been disbarred. Vadim Prokhorov, a lawyer who represented the journalist Vladimir Kara-Murza, has been forced to leave the country. So would it be fair to say that the authorities are simply destroying the legal profession in Russia?
Well, I mean, the legal profession actually was magnificent, and it was created by Alexander II after Russia's defeat in the Crimean War. It was an independent profession even during the Soviet Union. They were not state-controlled, as a matter of fact. And advocates have been really quite amazing up to, as I say, the real problem started in 2012 when Putin came back to power, exacerbated by the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. And actually, most of the people of my acquaintance have now left. And it's still, you can leave, actually, people I know go to Russia at the moment through Turkey. It's quite possible if you're not someone who's going to be arrested immediately when you arrive. So there are amazing people like Oleg Orlov, with whom I worked for all those years in the European Human Rights Advocacy Center. And he is his wife, a close friend. So he's one of the heroic people who's staying on. And is not being sent to prison, actually, has been prosecuted. And a number of people who are still alive are still there. But I would say the great majority have left because it's easy to leave to Finland or to Turkey. And of course, Georgia, I was in Georgia this summer teaching at the summer school of the Constitutional Court of Georgia. And there are now big problems again in Georgia where the government is pro-Russian and the people are very pro-Ukrainian, but also Tbilisi is awash with young Russian techies. And people are really fed up with them. They're taking up all the cafe space with their laptops. And they're not there ideologically, most of them. They're there because they think there might be a call-up in Russia, which hasn't been yet, but there might be. And, people are absolutely sick of them. And I think with the Russians in exile in the West, I went to Latvia last year, so Riga, for a conference that was meant to be a conference of the Russian opposition. And that was organized by Mr. Kasparov, the chess player. And really, I was there to talk about prosecuting Chechen war criminals arising out of the conflict in Chechnya. And me and some heroic people in Russia are still working on that as best we can. And so we had a workshop on that. Otherwise, it was hostile territory for me. I mean, they really didn't want to know me. And, you know, I think this often happens when you have people in exile who would like to be a future government. This happened in Iraq, of course. You know, I think that's one of the most glaring examples. So there are lots of really good people in exile doing the absolute level best that they can. But I have to say, it's a very complicated situation. And whether you see a lot of people make homes in Britain or in Cyprus or in the Baltics, wherever it is, will they return to Russia? Well, this is actually like the 19th century, where people like Gertsen, of course, you know, lived in London, and so did Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov for a time. And of course, London in particular, in the 19th century, was full of Russian exiles of one kind or another.
So are there things that human rights advocates that have left, and advocates, lawyers, are there things they can do from outside Russia to support human rights in Russia?
Well, they can't do it overtly because the recipients would go straight to prison for 15 years, you know, which would not be good. I'm on Telegram, as is everybody else, as are the Russian security services, but all kind of people are on Telegram. But I do keep up contact with lots of people in Russia. And that's how I was in the seminar in Moscow a few weeks ago. And I think people are doing their best to hold on, you know, people who are still there, to hold in there. But it's going to be a totally different environment. One thing, you know, it's not going to be like the days of Yeltsin, where there was more or less freedom of expression. And it was quite possible for human rights people to organize, and I was very much a part of that, so I know about it. And it was also possible for these crooks to make their billions during that period. And I think we're moving into, so I think you have said you want to ask me for my prediction. And the one thing I can say is that any prediction relating to Russia is going to be wrong. I think predictions relating to the United States, I mean, who knows what's going to happen? You know, Trump gets back in. You know, Britain at the moment seems to be in meltdown. And the United Kingdom will soon cease to exist. Actually, you know, I think that's an inevitability. So we're in this world, which we always have been, by the way. It's no better and no worse, I think, than it's ever been. But it is utterly unpredictable at the moment. And so I'm not going to make an idiot of myself by saying what's going to happen. In particular, Putin may well already be dead, of course. And when he appears to go out and about, it's a body double. And that's been, you know, or several body doubles. That's been proved. And of course, Russia is seething with young anarchists. And there's a tradition, you know, the Narodnaya Volya in the 19th century assassinated quite a few people in the Tsarist regime. And a lot of the kids who were protesting over Navalny have been roughed up, you know, imprisoned for periods and are coming out again. Many of them were actually members of anarchist organizations. And there is firebombing of recruitment stations all over Russia, sabotage. You know, so I think Putin lives in fear of, number one, time, of course, he's not immortal. Number two, generals, because he's got so rid of so many of them during the war. I think he must live in fear of a military coup. And thirdly, young anarchists. you know, and these are Russian traditions, by the way, going back hundreds of years. So whether my desire is to be given honorary Russian citizenship for my contribution to human rights and other kind of things like that. I've got a beautiful plaque from the Moscow Helsinki group for my contribution over many years. And my line is, if Depardieu can get it, then, you know, for heaven's sake. However, whether there will be a Russia with a president able to give me that honor, I don't know, nor does anyone. So I love Russia and I wish it the best, you know, really.
Yeah. The upcoming elections in March, right, are probably not going to be very free or very fair, but do you think they will have any real significance at all?
I think they have crucial significance. And of course, the way that a dictator, which is what Putin now is, actually stays in power is by keeping up not only a pretense of having popular support, but testing whether people are going to rise up with their pitchforks, you know, which has happened in Russia on quite a few occasions. So I think an awful lot actually is at stake in these elections. And one sees not only the riots in Bashkortostan last couple of days, but, you know, look what happened in Khabarovsk. Well, hundreds of thousands of people were out every day because of the LDPR governor being imprisoned. And I think the regime actually is extremely worried about this, you know, as a matter of fact. There's any chance whatsoever of Putin losing because there is no other candidate. And the family is a revolutionary, but not a politician. And he hasn't got a political party. He's an anti-corruption campaigner, but he had a very good organization all over Russia. And to some extent, it's still there. But I mean, when you look at people who are supposed to be the opposition, you know, my good friend Natasha Pelevina is in Parnas, led by Kasyanov. I said, really? You know, a party led by Mr. 10%. And, you know, Yabloko, I think, is an absolutely lost cause. And then you wonder, you know, I think there will be a political opposition, but where it will come from exactly, who knows?
So for our last question, I'm going to ask for another prediction, which you don't like to make. But I'm just thinking about the future of human rights in Russia and whether you see any points of light.
As much as there is in Britain or the United States. And I would say the United States, for example, the country is very hostile to international human rights. And there's one absolute right, which is the First Amendment, freedom of expression, which goes on much further in the United States than it does in Europe, for example. But the United States absolutely hates international human rights. And it hates the United Nations even, you know. So you know, I think Britain, of course, we want to get out of the convention, which was Churchill's invention, for heaven's sake. So I think there's a long tradition, actually, of rights in Russia. And I think in particular, what's happened under Katerina. So I've written quite a lot about this. You know, so the great Tsar of Russia was German, who corresponded with Voltaire, had Diderot to stay with her, was on her way actually to abolishing serfdom and perhaps a constitutional monarchy, except the French Revolution came along in 1789 and Pugachev rebellion. But then that was picked up again by Alexander II after the defeat in the Crimean War. And I like to remind people that Russia abolished serfdom 6 years before the United States abolished slavery, by the way. And people don't. And also the jury trial was introduced all over the Russian Empire as a result also. I mean, and it's still there, as a matter of fact. As well as the lowest level of judges who are called justices of the peace at Middle Voice today on the English model. And that was Alexander II as well. And I've written a whole chapter, the founder of law as an academic discipline in Russia, Semyon Desnitsky, studied for 6 years in Glasgow under Adam Smith and brought back to Russia the ideas and constitutionalism of Adam Smith, translated Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England into Russia, and he was a huge influence on Ekaterina. So there's many aspects of Russia that people are just, people think of Russia, oh, this is some kind of Eastern horror story. Actually, it's fully part of Europe and European history.
It's looking at history is a good thing, and I think that we don't do enough of that.
Well, I'm really American, you see, because my mother was Dutch American, and her ancestor was Philip Schuyler, whose daughter married Alexander Hamilton. So my ancestors fought against the British in the War of Independence. And my father was English American. His family were forced to leave Britain after the Napoleonic Wars when there was a big repression. And most people with my name are in Newfoundland, actually, Bowrings. So that my father was born in California. My mother was born in Clinton, Missouri, up in St. Louis. So I'm an absolutely rootless cosmopolitan. And I have the luxury of being able to look at the United States and Britain and Russia without too much of a commitment to their being perfect.
Well, we're going to have to end our interview now. This has been such a pleasure, and
Did you see who's behind me, by the way?
Yes.
That's an artwork by my wife, who did a BA and an MA in fine art. And actually, the portrait in the middle of it is Chekhov.
Really?
It's made up of flotsam and jetsam, but that's the speech at the beginning of Chaika, of the Wheel of Life.
Whoa.
So
that's great. Thank you so much, Professor Bowring, for sharing your perspectives and insights. As I think we're looking for ways to reverse the slippage in human rights protections, not only in Russia, as you say,
everywhere,
but in many parts of the world. So I hope we will see you again on a Rights in Russia interview, one of our English interviews, and I hope you recover from your COVID case as well.
It's my third time, and it's much better this time than previously. And I think having had all the jabs and having had it before, it is certainly much less bad than it was. Fingers crossed.
Well, it was very kind of you to appear.
No, I enjoyed it very much.
Your illness.
I love talking about Russia, by the way. I could talk about Russia all day and all night. But
well, it was great to have this opportunity. Really, thank you.
I really enjoyed it too. Thank you.
Okay.